Okay, let's unpack this. When you hear the word autism, well, a lot of times conventional thinking brings up challenges, right?
Hmm.
Social difficulties.
Hmm.
And for many people, it includes the idea of intellectual disability.
Hmm.
That's definitely part of the picture for, a significant group.
That is the typical perception, yeah. And it's true that statistically, if you look at the average IQ score in the autistic population, it tends to be lower than in the general population.
Absolutely. But here's the curveball from the source material we dove into. Recent large-scale genetic studies, they're uncovering a positive genetic correlation
Right.
between having a higher risk for autism and having high intelligence.
Which is truly fascinating. And the core puzzle here is exactly that paradox. You have these genetic variations, these specific alleles
Mm-hmm.
that show up more often in people with higher autism risk, but they also seem to show up more often in people with high intelligence. So the genetics seem to point one way
Toward high intelligence.
towards high intelligence, yeah. But then the average outcome on standard IQ tests for diagnosed individuals, well, it seems to lean the other way.
Okay, wow. So the genetic potential seems linked to high intelligence, but the actual measured average IQ in the diagnosed population is lower. How does that even work? How do we, make sense of that?
This is the central question, really, that our source material tackles. And it proposes a pretty powerful hypothesis to try and reconcile this.
Okay.
That autism isn't necessarily a disorder of low intelligence overall, but maybe it's being defined as a profile of high but significantly imbalanced components of intelligence.
Okay. Imbalanced.
Yeah.
So the overall score on a test might not look high because some things might be exceptional, but maybe other areas aren't, creating this kind of uneven profile.
Precisely. And this deep dive today is all about using the research you provided to pull apart that exact paradox.
Mhm.
We want to explore this high but imbalanced idea.
Right.
We're going to try and connect the dots, from the genetics to brain structure, look at specific cognitive profiles, and even touch on some surprising historical observations to really shed light on this complex relationship between autism and intelligence.
Okay, let's jump right into that initial finding then. The one that really sets the stage. This positive genetic correlation between autism risk and high intelligence, existing right alongside the reality of lower average IQ scores in the autistic population. That's where the mystery starts, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. It's the starting point for understanding this whole perspective. The sources highlight studies using things called polygenic scores,
Okay.
which, simply put, are just a way to measure the combined effect of thousands of tiny genetic influences on a complex trait.
Right, like intelligence or autism risk.
Exactly. And they found that these polygenic scores linked autism risk in, general population studies. They're positively correlated with the polygenic scores for high intelligence.
Okay.
But when you then study diagnosed individuals, the average distribution of their measured IQ is shifted lower compared to typical populations.
So the potential that seems to be baked into the genes looks like it's pushing towards cognitive strength.
Mm-hmm.
But the outcome on a standardized test, for many individuals anyway, points towards challenge. That's a really profound distinction.
It is. And it leads us right back to that core hypothesis we mentioned, that autism etiology involves these enhanced but significantly imbalanced components of intelligence.
Okay.
The idea isn't that everyone with autism has super high intelligence, the spectrum is obviously vast, but that the underlying genetic landscape and maybe the developmental path associated with autism risk involves specific cognitive abilities that are actually heightened.
Right.
But the way these abilities are configured, or maybe how they interact, well, that creates the profile we recognize as autism. And that configuration can lead to difficulties on standard measures because those tests weren't really designed for this particular kind of cognitive architecture.
Okay, I really want to deep into this imbalanced idea more. How does that map onto how we already understand intelligence in, people generally? Our source material mentions specific models of intelligence structure.
Yeah, one key model they bring up is the VPR model. That stands for verbal, perceptual, and image rotation.
VPR.
And this model basically describes the structure of intelligence after you remove the influence of the general intelligence factor, often called G.
So it looks at the more specific types of intelligence beyond just a single G score.
Exactly. It helps us see that even within typical intelligence, there are these distinct skill clusters.
Got it. Like different dimensions. So how do the cognitive differences often seen in autism fit into this VPR structure?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting, according to the sources. The cognitive profiles in autism seem to map surprisingly well onto this.
How so?
Individuals with autism often show particularly enhanced abilities in the perceptual domain.
Okay, perceptual.
Eh.
Like what kinds of things?
Think tasks involving visual spatial processing, really sharp sensory discrimination, or that intense attention to detail we often hear about.
Right.
But then their verbal skills and their image rotation skills, mentally rotating objects, are often described as either reduced or just sort of preserved, not showing that same level of enhancement.
Ah, okay.
So you see this stark contrast within the VPR framework. That's one way this imbalance clearly shows up.
So maybe really strong at seeing and processing visual and sensory details, spotting the little things, but perhaps less strong, relatively speaking, in, say, using language flexibly or mentally manipulating complex 3D shapes in their head.
That's just generally the pattern the source points to within that VPR model, yeah. They also bring in another common distinction often used in psychology: fluid versus crystallized intelligence.
Okay, I've heard of those. Fluid is.
Fluid intelligence is your raw problem-solving ability. Logic, pattern recognition in new situations, stuff that doesn't depend on what you've already learned.
Right, like solving a novel puzzle. And crystallized is.
Crystallized intelligence is your accumulated knowledge, your vocabulary, facts, skills you've acquired through experience and learning.
Got it. So how does that distinction play out in autism, according to the sources?
Well, the sources suggest that fluid intelligence is often relatively and sometimes even absolutely enhanced in autism.
Really?
Yeah. People on the spectrum can be exceptionally good at spotting novel patterns or solving problems that require pure logic, independent of learned knowledge.
Okay.
But crystallized intelligence, which relies much more heavily on typical social learning and absorbing cultural knowledge, well, that's often where you might see challenges leading to lower scores, or it might just be preserved at a typical level, not enhanced.
So again, an imbalance. Stronger fluid, maybe less strong, or typical crystallized.
Exactly. Viewed through that fluid crystallized lens, it's another manifestation of the same core idea.
Okay, so the hypothesis is really shaping up. Autism might involve these specific enhanced peaks in cognitive abilities, particularly in those perceptual and fluid areas, but potentially not across the board. And this unevenness, this imbalance, affects overall function and how someone performs on standard tests. That makes a lot more sense conceptually than just assuming low intelligence.
It really provides a framework for integrating lots of different observations that maybe seemed disconnected before. And the source material offers quite a bit of converging evidence for this.
Okay.
We can look at some of the specific traits and findings that seem to be associated with both high intelligence and autism. That really strengthens the hypothesis.
Yes, let's do that. What else connects these two seemingly disparate things?
Okay, first off, brain structure and growth. There's evidence linking large brain size, particularly rapid brain growth early in development, with both high intelligence generally and with autism.
Interesting.
The sources mention findings about things like the density of neurons in the prefrontal cortex and cortical thickness, showing overlaps between the two groups.
So the actual physical foundation of the brain, it seems like it might be wired for high-level processing in both cases, but perhaps develops in a way that leads to that specific autistic profile we talked about, the imbalance.
That's one potential implication, yeah. Another huge area is sensory processing.
Ah, yes. That's central to autism.
It is. But here's the nuance. The sources highlight a strong, established link between general intelligence, that G factor,
Right.
and basic sensory abilities, like how accurately and quickly you can discriminate subtle differences in sounds, sights, or textures. It's tied to processing speed and your ability to focus attention.
Okay, makes sense. Better sensory input, better processing.
Right. But here's a key insight from the sources that kind of goes against the common narrative of just being overwhelmed by senses in autism.
Oh.
They consistently report that basic sensory discrimination and acuity, the ability to detect fine differences, are often enhanced in autism across multiple senses: auditory, visual, tactile.
Enhanced, so sharper senses.
Sharper ability to pick out the fine details in sensory input, yes. And this enhancement seems to be linked to a stronger capacity for focused attention.
Wait, hang on. So it's not just being overwhelmed by sensation, but actually having a finer tuned ability to detect differences within that sensation. And that fuels attention. That's a really critical distinction.
It really flips the script for many people, doesn't it? This enhanced sensory ability and the strong attention to detail seen in autism are directly linked in the sources to concepts like hyperattention to detail and that analytical, systemizing cognitive style. The drive to understand systems, rules, patterns.
Right, the systemizing brain.
Exactly. They even mention studies that link this attention to detail, high intelligence, and surprisingly higher rates of autism traits or diagnosis in the family members of child prodigies.
Wow, okay, that makes a lot of sense, actually. Child prodigies are often incredibly focused on mastering complex systems, right? Whether it's music or math or chess.
It fits the pattern perfectly. And another really powerful piece of evidence they discuss comes from a specific cognitive test, the embedded figures test, or EFT.
Ah, yes, the EFT. I've definitely heard this test is used a lot in autism research. What is it again?
It basically asks you to find a simple geometric shape that's hidden within a much more complex, distracting picture.
Okay.
And the finding is pretty consistent. Performance on the EFT is significantly enhanced in individuals with autism, on average.
Better at finding the hidden shape.
Yes. And the sources emphasize that this strong performance isn't random. It's correlated with measures of fluid intelligence.
Which we said is often enhanced.
Right. And it's also correlated with that sharp visual sensory ability we just talked about. It really measures the ability to kind of disembed a detail from a complex whole, resisting the pull of the overall global picture.
And they contrast this with other conditions you mentioned.
Yes, the sources use EFT performance as a key example of how autism and, say, schizophrenia can sometimes appear almost diametrical, like opposites on certain cognitive measures.
How so?
While performance is enhanced in autism, it's typically reduced in schizophrenia.
Fascinating. Really points to potentially fundamental differences in how the brain is processing visual information in these conditions. What about other areas like interests and career paths? Is there an overlap there too?
Definitely. The sources note the well-known association between high general intelligence and professional interests in fields like engineering, mathematics, the physical sciences, STEM fields, basically. And study after study consistently shows higher rates of individuals with autism or their parents being found in these very same STEM fields. They mention studies looking at college students with ASD, for example.
So the sort of stereotype of the autistic engineer, maybe it isn't entirely unfounded, but perhaps it needs to be understood through this lens of specific cognitive strengths and biases that are linked to this particular intelligence profile.
That's exactly how this perspective frames it. It suggests it's not just a random correlation, but potentially a manifestation of this underlying cognitive profile, being drawn to those kinds of structured, rule-based, detail-oriented fields.
Makes sense.
And there's a historical echo here, too, which is interesting. The sources remind us of Leo Kanner's early observations back in the 1940s.
The psychiatrist who first described autism?
That's him. He noted that many of the autistic children he first studied came from highly intelligent families, often families with high socioeconomic status or SES.
Right, I remember reading that. But wasn't that sometimes dismissed as maybe just bias, like those families were more likely to seek diagnosis?
That was one interpretation, sure. But the sources suggest that modern genetic studies actually support a genuine link between high SES and high intelligence, and that the same genetic factors might contribute to both. Since these genetic factors also overlap with the autism risk alleles we discussed, it provides a potential genetic thread connecting high intelligence, higher SES, and autism risk, kind of validating Kanner's early observations from a modern genetic standpoint.
Wow. And finally, what about decision-making styles? Do they differ too?
Yes, the sources contrast the decision-making style often observed in high-functioning autism, which is described as typically more deliberative, maybe more risk-avoidant.
Careful processing of the details.
Exactly. Careful processing of all the available details before making a choice. They starkly contrast this with a bias sometimes seen in schizophrenia, often termed jumping to conclusions, where individuals might make decisions based on less evidence, perhaps weighting certain pieces of information differently. Again, it kind of positions autism and schizophrenia on different ends of a spectrum regarding how information is processed and evaluated before acting.
Okay, that is a really powerful stack of evidence. We've got genetics, brain development, sensory acuity, attention styles, specific cognitive test performance like the EFT, career path inclinations, historical links, even decision-making styles. They all seem to converge on this idea of a shared landscape between high intelligence and autism, mediated by these specific, sometimes enhanced, cognitive abilities. What do the sources say about the underlying genetics driving this? Is it different from what causes intellectual disability?
Yeah, the source makes an important distinction there. While intellectual disability is often linked to specific large de novo mutations, basically, significant genetic changes that appear for the first time in an individual and aren't inherited.
Right.
High intelligence, on the other hand, is known to be highly polygenic.
Meaning lots of genes involved?
Lots and lots of genes, each with a very, very small individual impact, all adding up. The hypothesis here is that autism risk, at least in these higher functioning profiles without major de novo mutations, might involve inheriting a particular combination or a high load of these same small effect alleles that contribute to high intelligence.
Okay.
But inheriting them in a way or in a combination that shapes the overall cognitive profile towards this imbalanced structure we see in autism.
And what about assortative mating? The idea that people tend to choose partners similar to themselves. Does that play a role?
It might. Assortative mating is known to be pretty high for traits like intelligence. People often partner with others who have similar educational backgrounds or intellectual levels.
Right.
The sources note that assortative mating also appears to be higher among individuals diagnosed with ASD. So this tendency for to attract could potentially lead to a concentration of these intelligence-linked alleles in offspring, potentially pushing the phenotype towards a more extreme state in some cases, perhaps manifesting as this more pronounced high and imbalanced profile associated with autism.
This whole idea of specific enhanced abilities.
Yeah.
It feels directly relevant to the discussion around savant skills and those incredible specific talents you sometimes see in autism. How does this high and imbalanced hypothesis help us understand those remarkable abilities?
This is where the hypothesis really shines, I think. The sources discuss the main theories about what underlies savant skills and talents in autism. Whether it's perfect pitch or calendar calculation, incredible drawing ability, mathematical genius.
Yeah, those amazing skills.
And these theories tend to converge on the idea that these talents stem from abilities like superior processing of local details, that intensely focused attention we talked about, enhanced sensory acuity, and exceptional pattern detection abilities.
Which are, hang on, those are precisely the cognitive traits we've just been discussing as being linked to both high intelligence and the typical autistic profile, right?
Exactly. The hypothesis provides a unifying framework. Savant skills and specific talents aren't necessarily some separate, mysterious phenomenon bolted onto autism. They can be seen as powerful, maybe extreme manifestations of these core enhanced cognitive components.
Okay.
The ones that are part of the autistic cognitive profile, particularly when that profile overlaps with the genetic potential for high intelligence.
What about the role of practice, though? We always hear about the 10,000 hours needed to become an expert in anything.
Oh, the sources definitely don't discount practice. They acknowledge it's absolutely crucial. They even use the analogy of London taxi drivers.
Oh, with the knowledge.
Exactly. Spending years developing the knowledge of all those complex city streets actually changes their brain structure, specifically the hippocampus. So practice is essential for skill mastery, no question.
No.
But they also point out the very high dropout rate in that taxi driver training program.
Suggesting that maybe just putting in the hours isn't always enough. You might need a certain underlying aptitude or predisposition to even succeed with all that practice.
That's the implication, yes. The same amount of intense practice will likely lead to vastly different levels of expertise in different individuals. It depends, in part, on their underlying cognitive strengths and predispositions. It's likely a powerful interplay between sort of innate potential and dedicated effort.
And the sources also mention cases where individuals with autism show multiple distinct talents, not just one.
Yes, and this is a key piece of evidence supporting the idea that the underlying predisposition to talent in autism might be largely domain neutral.
Meaning not specific to one area like music or math.
Right. It might not be a specific gene for music, but perhaps a more general cognitive style, or a set of enhanced abilities like that intense focus, the detail processing, the pattern recognition that can be applied with exceptional results to different domains if the interest and the practice are there.
Yeah.
So seeing one person with autism who excels at, say, complex calculations and has perfect pitch and is a gifted artist, that reinforces this idea of a more general underlying cognitive engine driving these talents.
That's incredibly insightful. It reframes it as being about how the brain is processing information, fundamentally, not just what specific information it happens to be good at.
Yeah.
And there was that striking anecdote in the sources about Gilles Tran.
Ah, yes, Gilles Tran. He has Asperger's syndrome, and his father shared this really vivid story. When Gilles was about 8 years old, he came home from a train ride.
Mm-hmm.
And while most kids might talk about the journey or where they went, Gilles apparently was immediately compelled to sit down and draw with intense focus the specific blinking ceiling light inside the train car.
The blinking light. Not the scenery outside, not the station, not the other passengers, but that one small, specific, intermittent detail flickering above his head.
Exactly. It's just a perfect, almost visceral example of that intense, detail-focused attention and that internal drive to capture and make sense of precise sensory input. That kind of focus seems so characteristic and, as we've discussed, often enhanced in autism.
We've touched on it a few times now, but the source material keeps making this comparison between autism and schizophrenia, sometimes framing them as potentially diametrical conditions. How does this view of autism as high but imbalanced intelligence fit into that specific comparison?
Yeah, the sources revisit this contrast quite deliberately because many of the specific cognitive differences we've been discussing seem to appear as stark opposites in the two conditions.
Okay, like what specifically?
Well, like we said, autism often involves enhanced focal attention and sharp sensory processing. Schizophrenia, on the other hand, is often characterized by things like reduced sensory precision and difficulties maintaining attention.
Right.
Autism often shows strengths in visual spatial reasoning and disembedding information. Remember the embedded figures test,
Finding the hidden shape.
right, where performance is enhanced. Schizophrenia often involves relative weaknesses in those visual spatial areas compared to, say, verbal abilities.
So almost mirror images in some cognitive profiles.
In some aspects, yes. And there seems to be a neurological angle to this diametrical view as well.
Oh, how so?
The source points to potential differences in brain connectivity patterns. There's growing evidence suggesting maybe local overconnectivity in the brain in autism.
Meaning nearby brain regions are too strongly linked.
Potentially, yes, which could maybe support that intense focus and detail processing. In contrast, schizophrenia might involve things like general brain volume reduction or perhaps broader network inefficiencies, suggesting a very different kind of processing landscape.
Okay.
So these patterns, both cognitive and potentially neurological, contribute to this idea that they might sit on opposite ends of certain important continuums.
Okay, so bringing this all together then, what are the major implications of adopting this high and imbalanced intelligence framework for how we understand autism and maybe even beyond?
Well, the sources argue pretty strongly that this perspective isn't about completely replacing all existing theories about autism. It's more about providing a powerful way to integrate many of them.
How so?
Ideas like the enhanced perceptual functioning theory, or the extreme male brain theory with its focus on systemizing, or even elements of the intense world theory regarding sensory processing. They can all be understood, potentially, as different manifestations or consequences of this underlying imbalance in specific components of intelligence.
So it kind of provides a common thread, a way to tie seemingly disparate observations together under one umbrella.
Exactly. It offers a framework. And crucially, it helps reframe the research questions we should be asking. Instead of just searching for genes for autism in a general sense, it pushes us towards asking how specific genes influence the development and function of different components of intelligence, like those verbal, perceptual, and rotation factors.
Right.
And then asking how imbalances in those specific components lead to the diverse range of autistic profiles that we actually see in the real world.
What about the broader implications? Did the source point to anything outside of just understanding autism itself?
Yes, definitely. By viewing autism through this lens of fundamental intelligence architecture, the perspective potentially offers unique insights into the genetic and neurological basis of high mental abilities in general, not just in the context of autism.
Interesting.
It could perhaps inform research into cognitive enhancement, maybe help us think differently about designing artificial intelligence by understanding these human cognitive components better. And as we've discussed quite a bit, provide a potentially deeper understanding of that complex, maybe diametrical relationship between conditions like autism and schizophrenia.
It really does shift the paradigm, doesn't it? Moving away from focusing solely on challenges or deficits to recognizing that autism, perhaps often, involves significant, even exceptional cognitive strengths, even if they come in this uneven or imbalanced pattern.
That's the core message, I think. It's about understanding the peaks just as much as we understand the valleys in the cognitive landscape of autism.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what we've really explored fundamentally challenges that common assumption, linking autism primarily with intellectual challenges.
Yeah.
The sources we looked at show us, through quite a lot of evidence spanning genetics, brain science, cognitive profiles, even historical accounts, that autism actually has this complex and frankly profound relationship with high intelligence.
Hmm. A relationship rooted in that idea of imbalanced specific components of intelligence are often enhanced, creating a unique cognitive profile.
And this perspective, it helps us reconcile those seemingly contradictory findings, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like the genetic link to high intelligence co-occurring with lower average measured IQ scores in the population.
It integrates those diverse observations from sensory sensitivities and intense focus all the way to specialized talents into a more coherent framework.
It really helps make sense of why someone might struggle profoundly with one kind of task, maybe something highly social or requiring quick verbal processing,
Right.
but then show absolutely breathtaking ability in another area, like visual pattern recognition or logical system building, simply because those tasks tap into different, unevenly distributed cognitive strengths.
It highlights the specific nature of the cognitive differences, moving us beyond just a generalized label.
And this leaves us with a really provocative thought for you, our listener, to maybe ponder. If autism is best understood, at least in many cases, as being characterized by this high but imbalanced intelligence, what does that really imply for our current methods of assessing intelligence? You know, those standard, often single-score IQ tests, they might be completely missing the nuances of these specific cognitive peaks and valleys.
They very likely are.
And maybe more importantly, how should this understanding change the way we approach education, support, and even just creating environments? How do we create spaces where these particular often exceptional strengths, maybe in areas like perceptual processing, attention to detail, fluid pattern recognition, can actually be recognized, truly valued, and allowed to flourish?